This video is brought to you by Nebula and TLDR's Race Across Europe. It's no secret that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have a difficult relationship. Johnson sees Sunak as a traitor, while Sunak clearly doesn't appreciate the constant speculation about a Johnson comeback, usually stirred up by Johnson's allies. Until recently, Sunak has avoided criticising Johnson in public, wary of upsetting Johnson loyalists in the parliamentary party. But after Johnson explicitly criticised him and triggered a series of difficult by-elections last week, Sunak finally hit back, and the feud has now escalated to open warfare. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Johnson's recent attacks against Sunak, Sunak's riposte, and who's going to come out on top. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. The recent escalation began with Johnson's resignation from Parliament last week and his accompanying statement, which attacked Sunak directly. In the statement, Johnson writes, "When I left office last year, the government was only a handful of points behind in the polls. That gap has now massively widened," before blaming Sunak for the Conservatives' electoral woes, urging him to return to Johnson's 2019 manifesto and asking why the government has abandoned the prospect of a free trade deal with the US and dropped plans to scrap EU directives. Johnson then implied that Sunak's isn't a properly Conservative government and warns the party shouldn't be endlessly putting up taxes, but should rather cut them, and not just as pre-election gimmicks. Clearly a dig at Sunak's plans to cut taxes ahead of the next election. All of this, Johnson says, is putting the Conservatives clearly at risk at the next election, just a few years after winning the biggest majority in almost half a century. To put it simply, Johnson is effectively sending a message to Conservative MPs that the current government is putting their jobs and the party in jeopardy, but he knows how to save them. Finally, 4 words slipped in at the end of the letter suggest his departure from politics may not be the end of the story. He says it's very sad to be leaving Parliament, at least for now. Johnson has been taking potshots at Sunak basically since the latter became Prime Minister, and Sunak has generally stayed quiet, preferring not to get caught in a mudslinging match with his predecessor. But an argument over Johnson's resignation honours list has gone public, with Sunak and Johnson now engaged in a full-on war of words. Without going into too much background, Johnson and his allies have effectively accused Sunak of interfering with Johnson's resignation honours list to prevent some of his allies from being elevated to the House of Lords. Sunak had this to say in response.
Honours and Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson asked me to do something that I wasn't prepared to do because I didn't think it was right. That was to either overrule the HOLAC committee or to make promises with people. Now, I wasn't prepared to do that. As I said, I didn't think it was right. And if people don't like that, then tough.
Hours later, Johnson issued a statement in response, accusing Sunak of talking rubbish and denying that he had tried to get Sunak to overrule the committee that vets House of Lords appointments. Meanwhile, Downing Street insists that it's entirely untrue to suggest that Sunak and his team tried to remove, change or alter Johnson's list of Lords appointments. Such a public fight between a Prime Minister and his predecessor but one is pretty unprecedented, especially when you consider that they're from the same party. Johnson's war against Sunak's government appears to be playing out in other areas too, including in relation to the COVID-19 inquiry, which is the public inquiry into the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. The inquiry has ordered the government to hand over a load of pandemic-era WhatsApp messages between ministers, staff and civil servants. The government, though, is very reluctant to do so, as it says it wants to avoid the release of any material that it considers unambiguously irrelevant. Interestingly, Boris Johnson says he's willing to hand over his own unredacted WhatsApps to the inquiry. He says he's made the offer to the inquiry, but says that it's been blocked by the Cabinet Office. Obviously, we don't know much about the content of those messages, but there are 2 possibly slightly cynical views of what's going on. Firstly, Johnson might be using the situation to project himself as the honest and well-intentioned one, while showing Sunak's government up as failing to meet its pledge of transparency. Alternatively, there may be things in those messages that are damaging to Rishi Sunak in particular that Johnson wants revealed. So there's clearly a fight going on between Johnson and Sunak. But who has the upper hand? We can broadly split the Conservative Party into three sections. First, the hard Sunakites, who are ideologically aligned with Rishi Sunak and who naturally prefer him to Boris Johnson. Second are the hard Johnsonites, who are uber loyal to Boris Johnson and would like to see him return as party leader. People like Nadine Dorries, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Priti Patel. Finally, you have the soft Sunakites, who make up most of the parliamentary party. They don't necessarily love Sunak and his managerial style of politics, but he's doing a good job, and definitely prefer him to Johnson. They also recognise that changing leaders again would be disastrous. As things stand, despite his allies being very vocal, Johnson doesn't have a huge amount of support in the parliamentary party, certainly not enough to take down Rishi Sunak. A good demonstration of this was the House of Commons vote on the Windsor Framework, which was basically Rishi Sunak's new post-Brexit agreement with the EU. Ahead of the vote, there was a lot of talk about Boris Johnson leading a Tory rebellion in opposition to the deal, but in the end, just 22 Tory MPs voted against it. But things could change, especially as Sunak's support is pretty soft. He has 3 upcoming by-elections to worry about, including seats that should be safe for the Conservatives, but are actually under threat from Labour and the Liberal Democrats. If these by-elections go poorly, then Johnson and his allies will surely ramp up their attacks on Sunak and point to the results as evidence that Sunak is on course to lose them in the next election. There's also an appetite, at least among some Conservative MPs, for change in the party, as evidenced by the National Conservatism Conference held last month, which was seen by many observers as a challenge to Sunak's authority from the right of the party. Only a handful of Tory MPs attended, but among those were big names including Jacob Rees-Mogg and Suella Braverman, the latter of whom literally serves in Sunak's cabinet. Something else worth considering is that despite the public battle being Johnson versus Sunak, in the event of a real challenge to Sunak's leadership, whether before or after the next election, then there are plenty of Conservative MPs beyond just Boris Johnson who are likely eyeing up the top job. Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch and Penny Mordaunt are some that spring to mind. So, in conclusion, Johnson has significantly stepped up his feud with Rishi Sunak. And while Johnson doesn't currently have the political weight to actually take him down, he can certainly do a lot to make Sunak's life a whole lot more difficult while he waits for the optimum moment to mount a comeback. This week we brought back our podcast, and our very first episode actually is all about this topic. So if you want to know more, then make sure you give that a listen. The link is in the description below. There's also some other huge news, by the way. We've just launched our new series, TLDR's Race Across Europe. Take a look.
To celebrate the 10,000th order from the TLDR merch store, we committed to hand-delivering orders to a bunch of real TLDR fans. So, we split into 3 teams, assigned points to each delivery location on the map, and let teams try to score as many points as they could in just 30 hours. The problem? Well, only one team is allowed to make each delivery, and any team which doesn't make it to the location of the 10,000th order by the end of the game is disqualified. Welcome to TLDR's Race Across Europe.
I'm a speed demon now.
Why is British transport the worst?
Oh no! I'm going to be fuming if they beat us this one.
Zach is obviously thinking, he's like, nah, Ben's not a threat, nah, you know?
It's gonna look like it when we lose.
Have you spoken to any other teams?
Guys, it's not looking good.
And thank you for ruining our journey.
This is the worst thing that could have happened.
And I wouldn't put it past him, he's a spiteful little...
What? What do you mean? What? How does that happen? We've come through some kind of police barricade.
Genuinely very much an open question as to whether or not Jack gets back to the UK anytime soon.
Yeah.
It was within an hour.
That's not possible. Did you have a ticket? Who's got the tickets? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Now, you can watch the first episode on the TLDR EU channel right now, but we're also releasing every subsequent episode a week early on Nebula. So if you're a Nebula subscriber, you can watch the first 2 episodes right now, totally ad-free. That's true of all TLDR content, by the way. We regularly release our videos on Nebula before they come to YouTube, and everything's ad-free, so not even this advert is here. It's not just the race either. Every week, TLDR produces well over an hour's worth of content, which is exclusively for Nebula. That's exclusive discussions where our team share their thoughts on the latest stories, extended daily briefings, our Nebula series This Week in Parliament, and even full explainers. So if you want the full TLDR experience, you really ought to be on Nebula. Sign up now using our link in the description to get everything the platform has to offer for just £2 a month.